languages die. The Gaulish language is an extinct Celtic language. The Welsh language is a living Celtic language, and they're both from the same side of the Celtic language two-sided family. And I think there's a lot we can learn from the death of the Gaulish language to keep the Welsh language and the Breton and Cornish as living languages. I'm Benjamin, and we're going to look into that in this video. To get across to you what Wales and the Welsh language and other smaller languages around the world can learn from the death of the Gaulish language, I need to explain a few things first. The world that the Gauls were in, what happened, then the decline of the Gaulish language, and then I can explain, well, what can we learn from this? What does this teach us? How can the death of this, continental superpower at one point prevent us from losing smaller languages in the future? As I said, this Gaulish language was Celtic. However, this was on the continent, and it arose out of this Latin culture. It was spoken before the Roman invasion across almost all of present-day France, parts of Belgium, Luxembourg, the Swiss plateau, southern Germany, with branching off dialects going east into the Hungarian Pannonian Plain and down the Danube, and into Britannia. Southern Britain would have spoken dialects that were mutually intelligible with this language. The continental Celtic culture, from present-day Lyon, going up the Rhone Valley and around the Jura into southern Germany, created or innovated metalworking, aesthetics, technologies for social organization that were not found further west. So what happened is the eastern parts of the Celtic world broke off from the more conservative west. Ireland and the Iberian Celts spoke a Q Celtic language, and Gaul and Britannia a P Celtic language. There was a cultural shift, a change that changed the language. And out of this change, this cultural shift, arose or was arising a superpower, the Gauls. They were between all of the different nodes or points of commerce across the continent, present-day France, a good position to be in. And Rome came along, and prior to the Roman invasion, the Gaulish script had been written using Greek letters, but this shifted to Latin. Most inscriptions in Gaulish are actually written in Greek, but we're not concerned with those. We're concerned with what happened in the decline of Gaulish. Julius Caesar invaded Gaul in 58 BCE, eventually defeating the king Vercingetorix in the Battle of Alesia in 52 BCE. Though revolts flared up in the decades after, Gaul was absorbed into the empire. After this invasion and conquest of Gaul, there was no clear indication that Latin would even begin to replace this language. Yes, there were points, small enclaves the Roman administration built, not far from Bibracte, the capital of Vercingetorix. But these were so insignificant in terms of the mass of population. Even after Caesar and his armies had killed off a third of the population, the Romans were not concerned with language. They were relatively tolerant to other languages. It's just that they were more concerned with Latin and Greek. They're like, well, why would I even bother with those other languages? However, the Roman Empire was not oppressive of minority languages. And this led, increasingly, to an adoption of Latin in some cases, willingly. And then, after a century of rule, things begin to change. You get Le Plomb de Chamelier, the Tablet of Chamelier. 6 men with Latin names here, writing. It's religious in nature, but even though these men are having Latin names, they have the Gaulish on attached to them. And the only person with a Gaulish name is the father of one of them, Eiddedechi or Eiddedelli. But here's the thing. Even though these men are having Latin names, they're inflecting it with Gaulish grammar, adding Gaulish endings to their names, while the older generation has a Gaulish name. Even though that, they are speaking Gaulish to each other, and even that, they are taking the time to carve their native Gaulish language into massive tablets for religious ritual and document purposes. So they're not giving up their language 100 years after conquest at all. In fact, I would say that Gaulish is clearly the de facto everyday language at this point. But Latin is beginning to shift the culture, and names 100 years later are shifting from Gaulish to Latin. Let's look at a few more of these. We have one inscription of Quintulos et Eponis. These are 2 Gaulish names, but the son, both of these names of this father are Gaulish, but his son, Tertius Quintuli. This is a Latin name on top of a Gaulish name, and the father's name, which is Gaulish, has been Latinized. The same thing with his sister, Quinta Quintuli. We also, in this period, we're talking the late 1st century going into the 2nd century, we have slaves, especially women, who once they achieve their freedom in terms of being a Roman citizen, are abandoning their Gaulish name and taking up a Latin name. However, throughout the 3rd century, people with Latin names are giving kids Gaulish names. It's back and forth. It's not just one way. Both are being used. One woman is even named Artula Ursula. Artula, Gaulish from Arto, a bear, cognate with Welsh arth. And Ursula, Ursus, the Latin for bear, cognate with Urs, French for bear. Yes, her name was Bear, daughter of Bear. But Gaulish bear, daughter of Latin bear. So they're playing with both languages. What this tells us is this is a bilingual culture emerging that's fusing these 2 languages into a new identity in the late 2nd century. The graffiti reflects this as well. So we've moved from dominantly Gaulish to peppered with Latin to fusing the 2 together into a new hybrid culture approaching the year 200. As Karen Stuber of Zurich University notes, the gradual replacement of Gaulish by Latin is not due to language contact. These people are so dense in number that they're absorbing Latin and using it in Gaulish ways. What did it was the imposition of the Roman administration, the imperial Roman culture, not the Latin language. In the 1st century, people are writing graffiti in Gaulish to flirt with pretty girls. Of the continental languages, Gaulish survived longest. And even after it was conquered, they're still writing in this language for 2 or 3 centuries after. And then it survived even after writing it appears to have been given up in their language for another 2 or 3 centuries. But that shows us stages of its dying off. It's a prestige language across the continent. A conquest comes. It's slowly etched into stone in a bilingual, an emerging bilingual culture, then fully bilingual. And then due to the prestige of Latin, gradually the writing in Gaulish is given up. And then once that comes, that break, towards the end of the 3rd century, then things begin to speed up in the demise of this language. The key is writing, and public spheres. We have impressive works for this language: the Calendrier de Coligny, the Calendar of Coligny. This accompanies Latin script and artifacts found around it and tells us this has a Gallo-Roman context from the end of the 2nd century. We have etchings in temples. Martialis, son of Denatolos, a Gaul of high rank, probably a nobleman, choosing a Latin name for his son, whilst still speaking Gaulish and passing down the Gaulish language to his son. Frontutablitiones. This is the Gaulicization of Latin names. They're clearly taking Latin and making it Gaulish. But the stability of bilingualism has a rupturing point. The 3rd century was very unstable across Gaul and the Roman Empire generally. You had 2 events. The crisis of the 3rd century, which was a rupture of civil wars, anarchy, Germanic invasions, economic decline. It was horrible. Plague. And you also had the Gallic Empire, the area centered around Gaul, also briefly Britain and Iberia, breaking away from the empire and it being led by someone who probably spoke Gaulish. We're not sure. He did come from a Gallic family. However, this Gallic Empire did not last. It was forcefully retaken into the empire. But that's a serious rupture, and as anyone who has looked at the Cornish language has seen, the period of the worst, steepest decline in that language was when there were political upheavals, ruptures, anarchic violence. And this, I think, has the same effect upon Gaulish at this very point in the middle of the 3rd century, because what comes after, it forces the empire to re-centralize, to change provincial borders. The road, which the Roman Empire had put in the center of the Gallic territory, running up to Cologne, this is dotted with a string of military forts, and then the military frontier is shifted really more from a military border to a militarized zone, miles deep. Thousands, tens of thousands of soldiers from across the empire, migrants in a sense, to be put into these lands, which before, the Belgae, this area there in the north, they had almost defeated Julius Caesar at one point. And what this tells us and why it's relevant to this conversation is because for you to have almost defeated Rome meant you needed a large population. And that meant population density, which keeps a language alive. What the crisis of the 3rd century did was shift around the populations of Gaul and removed population densities around Lyon and the Rhone Valley and toward the north, removing people there. These two would have split the Gaulish world into 2, those toward the Alps and those toward Morvan. Morvan is a Celtic word. And at the same time, you had really posh Gallo-Roman villas in the north, around present-day Paris, running up towards Belgium. These were abandoned because of German raids. And out of all of these turmoils and shifts and new militarized frontiers and economic ruin, something culturally Gaulish emerges briefly. The Bagidai. This probably means fighters in Gaulish. These are peasant revolts, and the fact that these people who are enacting in this have a Gaulish name tells us that the main segment of the ordinary population in the late 3rd century spoke Gaulish. There was an actual full-on revolt across Gaul for 3 years. The Roman Empire came down hard and then stationed Latin-speaking troops in the north. But these Bagidai they appear over and over again for the next 2 centuries or so. It's almost as if within the Gaulish-speaking culture there becomes a tradition of rising up in peasant guerrilla insurgency. We don't know if they were speaking Gaulish toward the end of that or not. By the 4th century, Gallo-Roman villages are abandoned as Germanic foederati are replanted intentionally. So the empire are bringing in multicultural and diverse groups of immigrants who are replacing the Gaulish language with vulgar forms of Latin and Germanic dialects. A multiculturalism is emerging, especially in North and Eastern Gaul. And what we have then are Franks, who are clearly meeting with Gaulish speakers. These are 2 distinct language groups, Celtic and Germanic, but they're turning to Latin to communicate with each other. They're not turning to learn Gaulish. And in some cases it looks like the Gauls are learning Germanic languages. That's important for what I'll say in a minute. In the early 5th century, Northern Gaul had become a patchwork of semi-independent Gallo-Roman lords, who were eventually conquered by Franks. Now let's step back a minute. We know these locations are where we have writing in this language, but hardly any of them are after the early 4th century. So something's happening there, and I think a lot of it has to do with the deep instability of the 3rd century and the militarization of the frontier, but also the roads. That's important when you consider Wales. Wherever the roads go, the Roman roads, the Latin language follows. By the end, we're getting Sprachinseln, language islands. Auvergne, in this region, the Swiss plateau. In the north, where that fierce tribe had been, the Belgae, bits are still hanging on there. And in Armorica, which would become Brittany, the southern part of it. There's no territorial integrity. These are removed from each other, and they're in highlands or remote areas that are not easy to get to. And most importantly, they don't have population density. They're beyond the towns, which the towns at this point, certainly by the 5th century, are being Christianized, and Latin becomes the vehicle of Christianity, the new faith. There's no evangelizing, from what we can tell, in the Gaulish language whatsoever. And that's key when thinking of Wales. Gaulish was dead as a community language by the 6th century, certainly, or the late 6th century. And it may have hung on in terms of there may have been speakers of it for a century or 2 later in isolated pockets, very isolated in the countryside. But it died. So how does this relate to the Welsh language? The Gaulish language lost urban areas to new ethnic groups, mainly Latin from the Italian peninsula first. Then bilingualism was established. Then, due to the prestige, writing was gradually left, and the cultural prestige was entirely Latinate. Then, immigrants were brought in who would turn to Latin and not Gaulish. I see the same thing, especially in Cardiff and here in Abertawe. Now yes, some immigrants do turn to our native language, but the vast majority of immigrants who are coming into this country are turning to English and adopting an Anglo-Welsh identity, just as exactly happened with Gaelic. People from across the empire adopted a Latin Gaelic identity, not a Celtic one. Then, new ethnic groups were brought in. Foederati, a confederation of Germanic peoples, with a new religion then from the south, through Latin and Christianity. We are seeing the same thing. with a confederation of loosely affiliated peoples under Islam, with a new religion, by the way, which Christianity was a new religion with a new language, Latin. Islam is a new religion with a new language, Arabic. All of these working together destroyed what should have been the language of a superpower. And we in Wales are facing the same types of problems, but we're not a superpower. However, we do have the ability to look back upon the Gauls and not let these things destroy our culture and remove our language and heritage, if we wake up to this in time. Diolch yn fawr iawn am wylio. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you next time.